I like that melody right now anyway. Sing it.
I've been blessed.
I have some video to tell you. This little bug, you see that where that fly was there? This little bug, I swear to you, was covering just him. He was right on top where that bug was, like that was the best place to hide. And he was just exactly on the place where the bug was, nose to nose. He's moved now, he's up here.
Yeah, I suddenly realized this is not a commune, this is not a church, this is just insanity.
And I acknowledge my mistake. I mean, I was a fool to join this organization and to commit so much of my will to it.
Once you enter People's Temple, you don't leave, or you don't leave very easily, because there were death threats. There was a lot of pressure from the congregation.
And they said, well, Mom and Dad, we love you very much, and we just hope that when you do decide to quit the church, you move far away so we aren't the ones assigned to kill you. And this is how thoroughly brainwashed we were. So that's the commitment that we all made when we finally decided to leave, that okay, we'll be killed for this, we'll probably be shot in the middle of the night or bombed or something, but it's better than going back.
Jones never loved anyone as the picture was presented. He only used people. People were pawns.
We had told every person we could find. We had gone to every agency. We'd sent documents, affidavits. We had called people pleading for help. Finally had just realized there is nobody that cares. There is no one that's going to help us. There is nothing we can do. And at that point, we accepted the fact that these people were doomed.
And it was so beautiful in the beginning of equal equality, you know, for everyone, and it sounded so beautiful until before we knew it, years had passed and he had become such a tyrant that we were mesmerized. We couldn't see the light anymore because he was such a good man in the beginning. And he's turned into a madman that wants to go down in history if he has to commit mass suicide and murdering our children.
Welcome back to Transmissions from Jonestown. You're listening to Episode 7, The Electric Koolaid Acid Tests. It can be difficult to reconcile the evidence collected in Jonestown with the popular consensus that the People's Temple willingly murdered their children and committed mass suicide. So many discrepancies, including the original body count, the mysterious presence of the CIA, and the mind-bendingly blunderous treatment of the crime scene witnesses and physical evidence during the first 4 days after the massacre, are reason enough to scrutinize the events that took place in Jonestown. The diabolical nature of Jim Jones and the suspicious background of many People's Temple members inspire many conspiracy theories as to the real purpose of Jonestown. Many researchers have theorized that Jonestown was a CIA-run medical experiment. The nihilistic hopelessness one must accept to subscribe to the drink the Kool-Aid conclusion to Jonestown's story is devastatingly bleak and dishonors the memory of the People's Temple. Their members were indeed willful, intelligent, revolutionary, oppressed, victimized, and murdered.
And I'm a member of People's Temple. Jim Jones is our leader. I'm a Marxist-Leninist, and I'm not ashamed of it. And that's what the third world don't like, because we are of the third world people. We're fighting for the rights of the underdog.
We supported many causes. We supported many people where nobody else would stand up for them. We set an example in the work that we did, the humanitarian work that we did. We got people out of jails. We brought people from prisons. We brought people out of hospitals, convalescent homes, from the ghettos. You name it, People's Temple has done it.
For years now, many of us here, comrades all, have struggled to try to teach and perfect in our own lives the principles that were laid down by Marx and Lenin for the guidance and the perfection of human society. I expect that all of us are somewhat idealists in the sense that both by example and by an attempt at persuasion, we've dedicated our lives to attempting to uplift humanity around us and ourselves in the process in order to reach those ideals.
We are not a death-oriented group. This group has existed for over 25 years and tried to involve ourselves in all aspects of life. In every aspect of life, the Marxist-Leninist view of total equality of women and men, no ageism, no sexism. In our community here, the means of production has been put in the hands of the people to develop the community and to try to be an example of that kind of community. But even when we tried to work through the democratic process to bring some kind of justice and the concern about fascism, we're in a socialist country, and we found inconsistencies where we were told to compromise our principles, not to feed people, not to advertise, or in some instances give medical care.
For those of you listening to this tape, to listen very, very carefully to the words of Jim Jones. Because here tonight, even at the hour of decision for a revolutionary suicide, in the words of Jim Jones, you will find, if you listen, the key to the survival of humanity.
I love you, and you've grown stronger, and when we do build a revolution, it'll be a right one, because we started without dreams that were pipe dreams. We didn't have illusions. We didn't have hallucinations. It was based on reality. Thank you. I love you. I love you. I love you.
Both redeeming and condemning Peoples Temple, the mass suicide theory dehumanizes the people of Jonestown and isolates their legacy to the annals of cult history, somewhere between the Manson family and Heaven's Gate. For nearly 1,000 people to willfully disappear into the abyss for a revolutionary movement, a movement that simultaneously ceases to exist, is a paradox only understood by those who experienced it. The concept of Jonestown, a microcosm containing in it the post-counterculture lost souls of missionaries, drug addicts, spiritualists, the disenfranchised, and the forgotten, with its promise of equality and freedom, is in every way a social experiment, testing the boundaries of the human mind to the very edge of oblivion. But was it more than just an anthropological anomaly?
At 3 in the morning, just hours after the mass suicide in Jonestown, the United States government received a radio transmission telling them that a mass suicide had taken place in Jonestown, sometime after the congressman was killed. The United States government had an attaché in Caracas, soldiers in Panama, and even more in Cuba. They could have been in Guyana within hours and possibly saved lives in Jonestown. But they stalled for 4 days, making excuses and delaying their entry until the bodies in Jonestown were so rotted, no autopsy or toxicology could possibly be done. The on-the-spot autopsies performed by Dr. Mutu were no more than vivisections on remains that hadn't even been properly identified. Dr. Mutu documented that out of 100 bodies he examined, 83 had injection wounds on their back that could not have been self-inflicted. The entire outer ring of bodies in Jonestown had puncture marks, and the U.S. soldiers sent to clean up Jonestown reported seeing syringes sticking out of people's necks. You may notice in the pictures of Jonestown you can't see any faces. All of the bodies are lying face down, dragged into position. The only body turned upright is Jim Jones, and that was likely for the sake of the news cameras. You can't clearly see very many children amongst the dead out of almost 400 that died there. The government said bodies were stacked on top of each other, but this wasn't visible in any of the crime scene photographs. In some pictures, you can clearly see bodies with bloody injuries that look like gunshot wounds. In other photos taken a day or two later, you'll see the same angle of the same bodies, but they are now covered in sheets. Also visible in several photographs are crossbow arrows, littering the ground and sticking out of the vat as though some kind of battle took place between Peoples Temple security and possibly Peoples Temple members unwilling to die or government forces that interrupted the death ritual. Someone in charge of the crime scene in Jonestown didn't want us to see the state of the bodies or to clearly make out the identity of victims in Jonestown. By delaying their investigation for 4 days, the U.S. government allowed the identity of the victims in Jonestown to be purposely obscured by decay, and the GDF compromised the evidence by looting and tampering with the scene. Some of the survivors went back to Jonestown and put tags on the toes of the bodies to identify them. The Army just threw the tags away and filed away half the bodies in Jonestown as unidentified. These were children given to Peoples Temple by the California Social Services and patients from mental hospitals and rest homes. Fingers were removed from many of the bodies, supposedly in an attempt to make identifications, but in effect stripped the dead of their last identifying feature. Clearly, there was something about the victims in Jonestown the Guyanese or United States government didn't want the public to see.
This episode of Transmissions from Jonestown focuses on connections between Jonestown and the MKUltra project. Once again, I would like to thank the anonymous contributors whom without their voices and opinions, this episode would not be possible. The theories and opinions expressed in this episode do not necessarily reflect my own thoughts or feelings about Jonestown. As always, I encourage you to research the Peoples Temple and decide for yourself.
My Uncle George was working as a narcotics agent in the late 50s in San Francisco. He told stories about a cat house on Telegraph Hill. The brothel was run by the CIA. They had installed two-way mirrors in every room. The girls would lure men back to the hotel and dose them with LSD while men in black watched from the other side of the mirror and took notes.
In 1947, Operation Paperclip recruited hundreds of German scientists to the United States. Forgiving many of their war crimes, the ex-Nazi scientists were allowed to continue their research to ensure continued American supremacy in the war against communism. Amongst the rocket scientists that helped get us to the moon, there were many chemical and behavioral specialists that had conducted human experiments in concentration camps. These men had served the Third Reich by dosing soldiers with methamphetamines, perfecting vicious interrogation and torture techniques, and brainwashing Deutschland for Goebbels and the Ministry of Propaganda. Allen Dulles, as the first head of the CIA, created a secret project that would later become known as MKUltra, suited to the particular skill set of the Nazi scientists. The goal of MKUltra was to alter the mind of an individual by using chemicals, electroshock therapy, hypnotism, torture, sensory deprivation, and an array of bizarre and inhumane treatments. The purpose of the project originally was to create a truth serum for interrogating Russian spies, but as the project evolved and hundreds of experiments in behavioral modification recorded the effects of drugs and hypnotism on an unsuspecting population, the purpose of MKUltra became far more sinister. The CIA wanted to know how to not just extract information from a person, but how to program the human mind. Experiments were conducted in over 80 prisons, universities, and mental institutions. The inhumane methodologies used required everyone involved to adhere to the highest level of secrecy. They experimented with LSD, ESP, psychic driving, and yes, even some men stared at goats. As time went on, the research became less metaphysical and more chemical.
I belong to an ancient trade union of spiritual teachers, scholars of consciousness, exploring without the pressure of time and space, the endless realms within. If I had my way, I would teach you how to sleep consciously, how to use symbols consciously, how to enhance and intensify your senses, how to contact the ancient wisdom of yourselves. Such a program is not an idle fantasy. In the summer of 1962 and 63, with a group of 40 Harvard graduate students, I participated in such a training program in a small fishing village in Mexico. We had rented a hotel there, which was a mile away from town. The main business of this center was the taking of LSD. We wandered from Mexico down through the Caribbean to the French islands, the British islands, looking for 1 square mile of ground on this planet where we could live quietly, expand our own consciousness, contribute handsomely to the country in which we live. But such a place was not to be found, free from political or religious interruption. But no such place seems to exist. For the first time in human history, there seems to be no land of exile or immigration where groups of people sharing unpopular spiritual beliefs and practices can remove to live in peace. Turn on, tune in, drop out.
Frank Olson was a bacteriologist and a biological warfare expert famous for his research in aerosolized anthrax. After a decade of working for the United States Blow Weapons Program, he was recruited by the CIA to work with the Technical Services Division in creating an arsenal of incapacitating and lethal materials. These materials would be used to poison crops and as biological weapons. In 1953, Frank Olson fell several stories from the window of his New York hotel room. His family claimed he had spent the week before his death paranoid and confused, and blamed the CIA for his mental breakdown. In 1975, the Rockefeller Commission started an investigation into MKUltra activities and uncovered proof that Frank Olson had been dosed with LSD at a work party the week before his death. After the bad acid trip, Frank's behavior was erratic, and some were concerned that a man with such high security clearance may have lost his ability to keep his mouth shut. The FBI claimed that depression caused Frank to throw himself out of the window. When Frank Olson's family announced their plans to file a wrongful death suit against the government, President Ford and then head of the CIA William Colby apologized to the family to the tune of $750,000. In 1994, Eric Olson had his father's body exhumed to be reburied with his mother. A second autopsy was performed, and it was concluded that Frank Olson died of blunt force trauma to the chest and head that could not have been caused by the fall. Frank Olson may have been murdered.
The source that I had was in the New York City Police Department, it was the Bureau of Narcotic Agents, and it was the CIA agents themselves. They all seemed the same, that he was pushed out the window, that he didn't jump. People who wanted him out of the way said that he talked too much, and he was telling people about the things that he'd done.
Another well-known MKUltra experiment was called Project Monarch, known in pop culture as the Manchurian Candidate. It involved brainwashing a subject and replacing their personality with a dual identity. The dominant personality leads a normal life, totally unaware of the hidden identity. Through the use of hypnosis, the subject was programmed with a trigger phrase that, when said, would activate the hidden personality, causing them to kill a perceived target, and afterwards remember nothing during or leading up to the murder. The target for the subjects were usually world leaders like Fidel Castro, but maybe they threw an American president or civil rights leader in from time to time. Many people believe that Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, or even the Peoples Temple's Larry Layton were victims of Project Monarch. By 1973, the CIA was up to its necks in conspiracy inquiries into foreign and domestic assassinations of world leaders and the illegal surveillance of Americans involved in the anti-war and civil rights movements. Director of the CIA, Richard Helms, ordered all documents relating to MKUltra to be destroyed. Fortunately for us, in 1977, 22,000 financial documents were discovered, proving that the American government had tested drugs and mind control techniques at home and abroad on unwilling participants, spanning nearly 30 years and costing millions of tax dollars.
Thousands of government-sponsored experiments did take place at hospitals, universities, and military bases around our nation. Some were unethical, not only by today's standards, but by the standards of the time in which they were conducted. They failed both the test of our national values and the test of humanity. Informed consent means your doctor tells you the risk of the treatment you are about to undergo. In too many cases, informed consent was withheld. For these experiments were kept secret, and they were shrouded not for a compelling reason of national security, but for the simple fear of embarrassment, and that was wrong.
And now we have a minister and his wife here from back east, and we're so happy to have them receive 2 children from our orphanage today. I want them to come right now. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, God bless you. And Ms. Jones, I understand. God bless you, Reverend Jones. And I understand that you're a registered nurse. Yes, is that right? That's right. Well, Lorraine Jost, our director, is a registered nurse, and I know that's going to be a big help with those children. Don't you kind of spend part of your time ministering to the sick?
Yes. Our church has a nursing home, a home for the aged, and I work as administrator.
And Mr. I want to call you Long, but it's Jones. I don't know why I want to call you Reverend Long. I wonder if you could give us just a little of your background, how you got into the ministry, and something about your church we're interested in, and your work back there. Surely your hands are full. This lady directs a home for the aged, and her husband has a church, and he operates it without salary. He receives no salary. Is that right? And you make you have your other income from other sources. And so how did you get into all this, and now you want 2 babies?
Just a desire to help people primarily is the reason. We've had a great interest in breaking down barriers between all races and nations and creeds.
You know why we want to adopt children? We want them to have a normal home, that's one thing, especially with Christian parents. We'll put those 2 little babies in your arms in just a few minutes.
As a teenager, Jim Jones worked as an orderly at the Reed Memorial Hospital. He delighted in using complicated medical terms that made him seem more educated than he was, and he always kept his whites their whitest. One day, while preparing the body of a pregnant woman for the undertaker, he met his bride-to-be. Marceline, who was attending nursing school at the time, watched Jones care for the body of this dead woman with such tenderness she felt endeared to him. Jim Jones would spend the rest of his life surrounded by and attended to by young nurses. Jones began selling monkeys door to door to fund his first church. Where the hell does a teenager in Indiana get South American monkeys?
In April of 1954, the Indianapolis Star printed an article regarding a shipment of monkeys from South America that had been refused upon receipt because all of the monkeys were sick or dead. The cargo's recipient was Jim Jones. As a teenager, Jones already had contacts in South America through Bloomington University's animal testing programs. Possibly the first casualty by association to Jones was his beloved pet chimp, who mysteriously died of strychnine poisoning. In 1956, Jones purchased his first church, a former Jewish synagogue in Indianapolis. The property was sold to Jones for next to nothing by Rabbi Maurice Davis, an activist who later worked for LBJ as the director of the American Family Foundation, an anti-cult organization that we will discuss several times throughout this broadcast. Rabbi Maurice Davis was also an associate of Dr. Hardat Sakdeo, the Goyanese deprogrammer that spent 10 days meeting with Jonestown survivors after the massacre.
In 1972, Rabbi Maurice Davis started a group called Citizens Engaged in Reuniting Families. They counseled children that joined cults or unorthodox religious movements and attempted to reunite them with their families. Jim Jones was basically given his first temple by Rabbi Maurice Davis. Jones wasn't Jewish, and his preaching methods were definitely unorthodox. Why would a world-renowned anti-cult activist help create the most notorious cult America has ever seen?
Does your churches have any love? Does your preacher talking about the sky god? Will he give you a ride? Will he give you any buses? Has he given you any of those homes? Has he given you help? Does he go into the court and the jails and set you free? Does his sky Jesus do you any good? No! I'm the only one that'll help you. I'm the only one that cares about you. I'm the only one that loves you.
Jim Jones spent the next few years rebranding the temple message from mere holy rolling to integrationist evangelism, earning him a small government role as the Indianapolis Human Rights Commissioner in 1961. He now had several adopted children, a successful if not profitable church, and a little bit of power. But Jones mysteriously left this all behind to travel to Hawaii, Cuba, and South America, in what is by far the most suspiciously vague part of his timeline.
Just after Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba, Jim Jones decided to help Black Cubans resettle in Indiana and farm patches of land he owned. Even before he was 30 years old, he was trying to establish a communal system of living that ran like an old slave plantation. Jim Jones traveled to Cuba in 1960. Very little is known about this chapter of his life. Cuba was a newly formed socialist state. The United States was sending CIA agents into Cuba to recruit mercenaries for the Bay of Pigs invasion. Their aim was to overthrow or kill Fidel Castro, so a CIA-backed dictator could take back control of the country. Jones may have been spying on Cuba for the CIA, using his evangelism as a cover. In 1979, in the wake of the post-Jonestown massacre press frenzy, a man named Carlos Foster came forward claiming that he had met Jim Jones at the Havana Hilton in the winter of 1960. There, Jones told Carlos his plan to help 40 Cuban families resettle in America and promised Carlos $50,000 a year if he could help him establish subsistent agricultural settlements throughout South America. Jones went to the slums and met with several Cuban families, He even claims to have met with Fidel Castro before his return to Indiana. Jones never did immigrate Cubans to join the church, but he may have collected important intelligence for the CIA on his trip.
Daddy, I come in to tell you I don't want to go to Cuba. Okay, Pop. And the United States don't give out check. If the Cuba people don't go to work for us, we're going to die anyhow. We come in here for security.
You say you don't make any sense? I think you make a lot of sense.
Not to forgive you, no trouble.
Well, let me tell you, you don't ever. And don't worry, Brother Pete, you're never going to go hungry. We'll all die first. Okay?
Jones had a habit of exposing himself in public restrooms where homosexuals were known to congregate. He was even busted in the bathroom of a movie theater attempting to solicit sex from a cop. Tim Stowen actually convinced the judge that Jones played with his junk at the urinal because he had kidney stones. Later, Stowen, abusing his power as district attorney, suppressed the case so the press never got wind of it. Jones was a closet homosexual unless he was amongst his inner circle, many of which were his lovers and thus sympathized with his eccentricities. In 1959, Jones got caught with his pants down again and fled to Hawaii, where he rested in a sanitarium until the situation blew over.
There's still strong pressure against homosexuality. Almost all the jokes are about men making it with men. You're a fucking faggot. Oh, yeah, well, you take it in the ass. Yeah, well, you suck cock and you know it. Hundreds of men thrown together by the system, sometimes for years and years at a stretch. And the worst insult they can throw at someone is that he might want to make love with another man. Worse, look at the homosexuality the brothers do allow. The sickest goddamn kind. Where one man brutalizes and exploits another. One man plays the role of the man, the other, usually younger, smaller, less hairy, more boyish looking, plays the role of the kid. The kid is the slave. The stereotype. The man, afraid he will be considered a fag if he acts like he really likes the kid, comes on. Yeah, I fuck him in the ass. He sucks me off. He does all kinds of shit for me. And I let him hang around. The man would never admit to having any feelings for the kid. He would never admit to giving anything sexually. Just taking. In order to justify himself, he plays the role of the woman in America, the kid does. Taking the man for all he's worth, getting food and drugs and presents from the man and threatening to leave for another man if this man doesn't provide enough goodies. Under all this sick play acting, often the two men like each other deeply down deep, but are so frightened by the system the prisoners have set up that they have to pretend they are using each other. Why do prisoners approve when one man boasts of abusing and exploiting another man, but get totally threatened when two men just say they really dig each other?
Throughout the history of Peoples Temple, Jim Jones received psychological treatment in sanitariums. During the 60s and 70s, he was treated at the Langley-Porter Neuropsychiatric Institute in San Francisco. His medical files are still sealed, but a witness stated that in 1967, Jones was treated for manic depression and was a documented sociopath. Dr. Margaret Singer, world-renowned clinical psychologist, anti-cult activist, and brainwashing expert, received funding through the Langley Institute. She was also a member of the American Family Foundation, headed by Rabbi Maurice Davis. The Defense Department funded a program at Langley that experimented with behavioral modification using electromagnetic fields and long-distance hypnosis. The military wanted to use extremely low-frequency radiation for the purposes of mind control. Theoretically, the human brain cannot tell the difference between extremely low-frequency radiation and its own brain waves. The frequency could be used to kill or shut off the brains of thousands of people within a small radius.
Recently, a Canadian mining company discovered approximately 6 million pounds of uranium near the Roraima Basin in Guyana. It is possible that Mount Roraima itself broadcasts low-frequency radiation. This might explain why Guyana has the highest suicide rate on the planet.
Ironically, after the survivors of Jonestown had been treated by Dr. Hardat Sugdeo and returned to the Bay Area, they were all treated at the insistence of Mayor George Moscone at the Langley-Porter Neuropsychiatric Institute. What happened in Jonestown may not have started at Langley, but it certainly ended there. The very institution responsible for the mental health of Jim Jones now treated the survivors of his mental breakdown.
If by any chance you would make a mistake to try to come in and take any one of us, We will not let you. You will die. You will have to take anybody over all of our dead bodies. Wherever in the hell it's brought us on principle, it brought us on courage, and it brought us to the right place. And if we hold on, we'll make it. I never heard a man speak like this man before. I never heard a man speak like this man before. All the days of my life, ever since I've been born. I never. Louder, louder. Clap your hands. I never.
At this point in his timeline, Jim Jones now has 2 passports and a visa to visit the Soviet Union. Rather than go to Russia, which I'm sure for Jim Jones was a lifelong dream, he went to South America, where he made anti-communist speeches in Guyana and supposedly worked for Eureka Laundries in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. This also marks a point in Jim Jones' life when he started hearing voices warning him of an impending nuclear apocalypse. He struggled with his faith, or lack of it, in Brazil, studying Macumba and African voodoo. The direction his life was going and the mission of his church were on his mind. Jim Jones professed to be an atheist to his wife Marceline, a fact that deeply disturbed her given his profession. But through evangelism, he was spreading his true passion: socialism.
Principle is a recipe. The recipe today is total racial, social, and economic equality. The way to that recipe is love, but you have to define love. Some people think love means sex. That's the farthest thing from love. There's nothing farther from love than sex. Sex is animalism, sex is sensuality, sex is narcissism. I'm not knocking it, but there's no love in it. So this love has to be defined today. And how do we define love? Some call it socialism. That's been badly abused by Nazi Germany. They call them Nazi National Socialists. Well, they're anything but socialist. So the word socialism has been badly abused. The word communism has been badly abused. But on the day of Pentecost, they had all things in common. Perhaps we should call it communism or communalism. You have to share. You have to think of your brother or your sister above yourself. You give your life and then you find it. Jesus said, deny yourself. Buddha said nirvana, complete self-death. But Jesus taught the same thing. Buddha taught the same thing. Krishna taught the same thing. All the great world religions taught the same. Lose your life in service to others.
Jones had been spying on his congregation for almost a decade, using every trick he could to aggrandize himself in their eyes as a mystical healer and prophet. Though he knew he was merely a con man, the lies and trickery had caused real social reform and integrationism in his church. The means were always justified by the end. If he had to lie, cheat, and steal to feed the children or save an African American from persecution, he was definitely up for it. If Jones could rationalize the dishonesty woven into his faith healings and testimonials, then isn't it possible that Jones thought working with a government entity to effect radical change in America might have been worth a few thousand lives?
Neighbors in Belo Horizonte thought Jim Jones and his family were working for the CIA. At the time, the Central Intelligence Agency was all over Brazil, preparing to overthrow the leftist democratically elected government and replace it with the junta. Jones would leave every day in an American consulate car and return late every night. Jim Jones would talk about his friend Dan Mitrione. They had known each other in Richmond, Indiana. Jones preached civil rights on the streets in Richmond, and Dan Mitrione was a cop. Now in Brazil, they were both living in Belo Horizonte. This was not a coincidence. While the CIA trained guerrilla death squads for the junta, Dan Mitrione was perfecting his interrogation techniques and developing a complex system of torture for counterinsurgency routines. Jim Jones, with his faith healings, mass conversions, and a taste for sadism, was a willing apprentice for Mitrione, who taught Jones all there is to know about torture and intimidation. After Jones received his training, he settled in Rio and lived large until just after the assassination of President Kennedy. Maybe Lee Harvey Oswald gave him cold feet about working for the agency, or maybe his orders were finally in. Jim Jones's file with the CIA was immediately purged after the murder of Dan Mitrione in Paraguay.
Jim Jones returned to Indiana. Miraculously, he now had over $100,000 to move his congregation to Ukiah. The Peoples Temple opened a rest home, halfway houses, and foster homes. They took in hundreds of foster kids. cared for the elderly and disabled, and even rehabilitated parolees.
The Happy Havens rest home was set up by the People's Temple. It had an electric fence and a guard tower. The place was a prison, a concentration camp. Trained attack dogs kept people out, and armed guards kept people in. The place was filled with foster kids and elderly who had no family left. Jones was getting nearly $1,000 a month per child and $700 per senior citizen. These people were basically undocumented and alone in the world. Jones was cashing checks for people no one kept track of.
Now, I was taking an offering, not for a man, but for the cause of God. I won't handle a penny of it. But will you get your offerings in quickly? Everyone should have an envelope today. If you wish to remain in the Lamb's Book, you better respond to what you've seen today. There will be one day when everybody will have to follow and get out of here. You won't be following a Pied Piper. You'll be following the voice of one crying in the wilderness.
As the People's Temple grew, Jones' bank accounts overflowed with thousands of monthly Social Security checks and mandatory offerings. Marcelyn Jones worked as a nurse inspecting convalescent homes for the state of California. She and several other People's Temple members also worked at the Mendocino State Hospital. The state hospital had once housed some of the most dangerous criminals in California. It was famous for sterilizing thousands of patients in the 1920s and conducting strange experiments throughout its history. By the time the People's Temple came to the state hospital, it had 1,800 patients and was half torn down. Ronald Reagan wanted to deinstitutionalize America and privatize mental health care. The People's Temple migrated patients from the institution into temple rest homes and facilities up to its eventual closure in 1972.
According to the records from the Department of Research at the Mendocino State Hospital, in 1967, several experiments with LSD were performed on patients to test the effects of the drug on human DNA. The People's Temple drugged patients with LSD for long periods of time, reporting to the research department that LSD did in fact induce chromosomal breakage. In another study, 71 alcoholic women were given LSD to test its effects on alcohol addiction. Here is a quote from the study, written by a People's Temple member. Most of the women enjoyed the music, though some of it wanted it turned off later in the day. Most lay quietly on the lounge and showed some feelings. Some thought of issues as large as the meaning of life and their place in it, while many considered tearfully their relationship to husband, children, or boyfriends. They often lay peacefully from 8 to 1 o'clock, with a little leisurely moving about from 1 to 3 or 4 p.m. Only 3 sessions out of 82 were terminated early because of the subject's reaction. Most indicated physical discomfort or fear of dying and found the experience intensely memorable and real. Almost none felt suspicious of others or unduly influenced by the other's presence. They felt a high level of trust and affection. 75% felt a spiritual bond with others. 72% felt a unity of all things and that they were part of this unity, which 60% were willing to call God. 80% found they gained a more complete acceptance of others, and 84% felt their own understanding was enhanced.
In Jonestown, an eyewitness report stated that once a week, the people would line up to receive a special cookie. Many have theorized that this was an experiment. Some cookies contained drugs, while others were merely a placebo. The long line of People's Temple members waiting for their cookie reminds me of the medication lines that form outside of a nurse's station in an asylum. Although Jim Jones often discouraged the use of recreational drugs within his congregation, he was a true experimentalist when it came to his own drug use. Very early in the temple history, the necessity of B12 injections and vitamins was just a normal part of life for Jim Jones. People's Temple workers were mystified by Jim Jones' ability to never sleep and his tireless 8-hour sermons. Later in Jonestown, it was revealed to most temple leadership that Jones was suffering from a debilitating drug addiction. His B12 was really methamphetamines, and his vitamins were barbiturates. By that time, the use of the box had become a part of temple life. If a person broke rules in Jonestown repeatedly or attempted to escape, they would be put into the box buried underground. They were shot up with Thorazine and kept in the box for days. Afterwards, they would emerge, minds altered, in what was described as a zombie-like state. The People's Temple acceptance of the necessary disciplinary measures like the box and their dependency on drugs to maintain order in Jonestown demonstrates a clearly experimental view towards drugs.
And I haven't got a sight problem now. These suckers have gone and given me a shot for my pain. I still got pain, but they give me such a shot that I'm out on cloud 9. I got my pain, and I got on an empty stomach, I got whatever the fuck you give me. And I feel like I like to vomit about 10 feet. So you tell your neighbor the 3 miracles. Believe me, you don't want drugs. They don't feel good.
The free clinic in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury was funded by MKUltra. They did experiments with drug and alcohol addiction on unsuspecting populations of peace-loving hippies. Methamphetamine abusers were sent to the Mendocino State Hospital to take part in the methadone attack therapy trials. The Peoples Temple experimented with shock therapy and drugs on addicts and criminals, trying to discover pacification methods. The temple was also trying to design a method of hypnosis using sound and radiation. All of the experiments done by the Peoples Temple at the Mendocino State Hospital were funded by the CIA.
After the eventual closure of the Mendocino State Hospital, Jim Jones would make good use of a cornucopia of strange medical devices acquired by the Peoples Temple.
A child in Jonestown had stolen some food, so Jim Jones told her, "Now you're gonna have to visit the blue-eyed monster. Good little communists don't steal." He took the little girl, not 5 years old, and put her in a dark room bound to a chair. All around her she saw the electric eyes of the blue-eyed monster. It bit her on the back, tearing open the back of her shirt. She screamed, tears streaming down her cheeks. As the monster bit her over and over again, Jim Jones scolded from a corner in the room, giggling as she wept. They had surrounded her with cattle prods in the dark. They were electrocuting her on his command.
Maxine Harp joined the Peoples Temple in 1969. She and her 3 children moved into a temple-sponsored communal living center. She worked in the Mendocino State Hospital as a dental assistant. Within a year of joining Peoples Temple, Maxine was found hanging in her garage. Officially, her death was ruled a suicide.
The Peoples Temple ruined Maxine Harp's life. She fell in love with a welfare worker named Jim Randolph. He was a Peoples Temple loyalist using the public welfare system to send foster kids and elderly to live in temple homes. Jim encouraged Maxine to divorce her husband and move into a temple-run commune. She was assigned a welfare caseworker, another temple member named Sharon Amos. Sharon is famous for murdering her 3 children in Georgetown the night of the mass suicide. Sharon also enjoyed bragging that at one time she had run with the Manson family. Yet another temple member, Timothy Stone, counseled Maxine during the divorce. When the divorce was finalized, Maxine signed her settlement over to the temple. It was the equivalent of her life savings. Jim Jones had encouraged Jim Randolph to lead Maxine on so they could get to her assets. Once Maxine signed everything over to the temple, Jones ordered Jim Randolph to end the affair. Maxine was devastated and immediately felt alienated by temple members. She lost her job and asked Sharon Amos to help her get on welfare so she could feed her 3 children. Sharon refused and threatened to report Maxine to the state as an unfit mother and put her 3 children into a Peoples Temple-run foster home. Maxine felt as though a conspiracy was working against her. Even her lawyer, Tim Stone, wouldn't take her calls. The day before her death, Maxine confronted Jim Jones. He responded by saying, "Why don't you just kill yourself? Get it over with." After Maxine left later that night, Jones predicted at a Peoples Temple meeting that Maxine Harp was going to die. The next night, Maxine Harp was found hanging from the rafters in her garage. There was a note written on an old grocery bag nearby instructing the children to call the Peoples Temple in Redwood Valley and sit tight. Jones, Jim Randolph, and several others removed all evidence connecting Maxine to the Peoples Temple from the house. They took her body down and removed her clothes, careful to remove the Peoples Temple prayer cloth she wore. Then they redressed and rehung her. Jim Jones instructed the children to call the police, and they left the scene. Jim Jones had to utilize Peoples Temple members who held positions in local government to suppress the physical evidence in the case and ensure the press knew little of Maxine's ties to the temple.
Bob Houston worked at the Mendocino State Hospital as a musical therapist. At night, he worked at the rail yard. Bob was found crushed by a train car days after trying to defect from the Peoples Temple. Even though he was known to be a safe and conscientious worker, his death was ruled an accident. Congressman Leo Ryan first heard of Peoples Temple when Bob's grieving father, a close friend of Ryan's, relayed the tragic story of the suspicious death of his beloved son.
John Head was a mental patient at the Mendocino Institution. While receiving treatment at the hospital, John received a $10,000 insurance settlement. People's Temple members who were treating John for his depression encouraged him to turn his cash into silver bullion. Once John was released from the hospital, he joined People's Temple and signed over his life savings, including $10,000 in silver. 3 weeks later, John was begging for it back. He had reconnected with his family, and now he wanted out of People's Temple. The following day, John fell off of the roof of a 3-story warehouse. His death was ruled a suicide based on his medical history provided by the Mendocino Institution and the People's Temple.
In 1972, Reagan defunded America's institutions, and the remaining patients at the Mendocino State Hospital were transferred to People's Temple-run facilities. The hospital was torn down, and its record spanning over 75 years became barely accessible and mostly lost to the sands of time. On the plot of land where the state hospital once sat now sits the Temple of 1,000 Buddhas. Inspired by the tragedy in Jonestown, many people who had relatives die in the Mendocino State Hospital have tried to track down their remains, but sadly, no clue as to where the old graves went exists.
In 1968, a year before the Manson murders, Susan Atkins was busted with drugs in Mendocino County. She was well known to local law enforcement by her alias, Sadie Mae Glutz. As Susan awaited trial, the Manson family hung around Ukiah. Charlie even visited her in jail. While the Manson family was in town, 2 women were violently murdered in an antique store. They were beaten with a leather strap and strangled. A year later, after the Tate LaBianca killings, the detectives working the Mendocino double murder case started looking into the Manson family. Apparently, a week before the murders, Charlie and some friends were pulled over while tripping on acid. There was a small child in the car. The arresting officer called social services, and the child, Charlie's child, was put into state care. The police were investigating whether or not the double murder was perpetrated by the Manson family as a revenge killing for putting Charlie's kid into a foster home, a People's Temple-run foster home. According to a recently released autobiography of Charles Manson, Charlie had thought about settling the family in Ukiah. He liked the underground cave networks and the lack of federal drug enforcement presence, but he decided against it when a strange, unnamed preacher from the hills had upstaged him.
That I know. We've been living in the name of Jesus. We're living in the name Jesus Christ our God, living in the name of Jesus Christ our God, no other name. Yes, all right, all right, all right, all right, all right.
Under the umbrella of MKUltra, from 1967 to 74, the CIA ran a program dubbed Operation Chaos. The idea was to infiltrate anti-war and civil rights groups to uncover any foreign influence that might cause domestic dissension. Agents were to join radical organizations and report back any communist or antisocial behavior. As Operation Chaos spread out amongst college campuses, they infiltrated the Black Panthers, Students for a Democratic Society, the Women's Liberation Movement, and hundreds of other counterculture groups. The CIA even privately funded trash collection companies to collect evidence against these groups. The beauty of Operation Chaos was that every agent or informant working in the field answered only to their one control, meaning that many infiltrated groups had multiple undercover chaos agents reporting on each other, digging through each other's trash, and documenting un-American activity perpetrated by fellow agents.
I don't think Jim Jones was a willing participant in mind control experiments. We know that several people on the Planning Commission had originally joined People's Temple to spy and were receiving money from the FBI. Some admitted this to Jones, but I believe many of his lovers were manipulating him and slowly poisoning him. Jim Jones didn't administer the drugs in Jonestown. The nurses did. In the beginning, Jones really did fight for equality and tried to integrate the church. That's exactly what put him on the FBI's radar. As more agents worked their way into his bedchamber, he went mad, becoming paranoid and sadistic. His closest aides supplied him with drugs and even signed the lease in Guyana. They used his power over his people to trap them in Jonestown. Jones started to realize that the forces that were trying to destroy his movement didn't come from outside. They had always been there, feeding him drugs, slowly poisoning his soul. Digging through the FBI documents released after the Freedom of Information Act, there is solid proof that a small group of people in Jonestown, working in the clinic, were trying to poison Jim Jones. Methods on how to poison his daily milkshakes and secret notes passed amongst the undercover agents so ironically mirror the poisoning plots of Fidel Castro's mistress.
For the third time running, someone has tried to poison my food. We have the sediments. We're going to study them under the microscope. What kind of beast do we have in our midst? But don't you worry. If you're guilty, we'll find you. If I catch you, the court won't have any opportunity to deal with you, but I'm going to hang you on the highest tree I can find. That kitchen crew, I want you to watch that food. But we got some kooks in our midst. You think you're smart, don't you? You think you're dealing with this ordinary man. Where till I get through with you? So we're going to put surveillance on food. I'm sick of this. It's enough trouble trying to stay awake, alert, and on the ball to defend my people. To have somebody give me enough to knock out a horse. God damn you. You can give me enough to knock out an elephant and I'll still be there to beat your ass.
Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters embarked on their metaphysical quest to enlighten mankind through the use of LSD in the late 60s. Traveling around America in a psychedelic bus, they chronicled the rise of the hippie movement while dosing flower children in what they called the electric Koolaid acid tests. An acid test involved drinking Kool-Aid spiked with LSD to expand one's consciousness. Ken Kesey's first acid trip took place as part of a Stanford University study on the effects of LSD. Years later, it was revealed that this study was funded by the CIA as part of the MKUltra project. The government's attempt to control the masses and manipulate the mind with LSD had backfired into the counterculture anti-war movement.
In the late 60s, life at Peoples Temple had become far more regimented. Jim Jones never seemed to sleep and insisted everyone put in 16-hour days working on propaganda for the temple. People were exhausted. They donated all their money and property to the temple and had to depend upon Jim Jones for food and clothing. Even the simplest things became luxuries. Families were split apart. Jones didn't want parents raising their own children or couples to get too intimate. His divide and conquer technique worked well. People were too exhausted to question his authority. Everyone was scrambled between different communal living situations or sleeping in the temple in 4-hour shifts. People were hungry and tired, but Jones demanded complete obedience. Any misstep was met by brutal punishments. Children were beaten with a 2x4, dubbed the Board of Education, in front of the congregation, some until they lost consciousness. Jones made his security guards box old men and women for tiny infractions of temple rules. He threatened that everyone was being watched and warned people that he could read their minds. After church services, Jones would hold planning commission meetings with his elite staff that went on all night. There he would force lovers to undress and confess made-up infidelities. He accused most staff members of being sexual deviants and made them sign false documents stating they had performed unlawful sexual acts or had abused children. Jim Jones was homosexual and had relationships with many men in the church. It's been documented that Jones was likely the culprit who spread genital warts throughout the planning commission. Although many People's Temple members were unaware of Jones's drug addictions to meth and morphine or his dubious sexual relationships with staff, the planning commission was well aware. The upper echelon of People's Temple was mostly white and well-educated. They enjoyed far more freedom than the average temple member. They spied for Jones, dug through trash, and helped him fake faith healings. Jones stole money from the old, the sick, and the poor, and no one tried to stop him. When Jones ordered a temple member to be drugged and taken to Jonestown, his staff obliged. And when he told them all to drink the Kool-Aid and die for him, they handed out Dixie cups. We know now that multiple informants working for the FBI had infiltrated the temple's planning commission and had even taken part in suicide drills. Yet none of the abuse, druggings, or suicidal overtones were ever addressed by the authorities that could have stopped it.
We may never know the true motives of Jim Jones or the People's Temple. What the government knew about Jonestown and to what degree they were involved is a closely guarded secret, possibly buried forever along with the people who lived it. But one thing is for certain, whether by unlucky coincidence or malevolent conspiracy, the government of the United States empowered Jonestown and crowned Jim Jones with totalitarian power.
In 1979, just months after the tragedy in Jonestown, the Prime Minister of Guyana, Forbes Burnham, hosted a breakfast for the press at his country residence in Belfield. He wanted to discuss the manipulation of facts by the foreign press in Guyana and how it related to the Jonestown tragedy. An excerpt from the CIA cable regarding the unusual meeting demonstrates just how complacent people within our government actually were, and how much they wanted to disassociate themselves from Jim Jones.
Burnham faulted the official media for their poor perception and judgment as to what is important for Guyana. To illustrate the point, he complained that Jonestown was given excessive coverage and prominence for too long by the official media, when everyone knows that Jonestown was an American problem transported to Guyana, and therefore clearly not a Guyanese problem. He pointed out that Jim Jones came to Guyana with recommendations, not from Guyanese officials, but from prominent Americans, no less than Mrs. Carter and Vice President Mondale. Jones came with credentials, not from Mayor Cecil Persad of Georgetown, but from Mayor Moscone of San Francisco. Burnham told his guests that when Deputy Prime Minister Reed met Vice President Mondale in Washington at the Panama Treaty signing ceremony in September of 1977, the Vice President asked Reed, "How's Jim doing?" thus indicating a personal interest in the People's Temple leader. He also brought the USSR into the picture by referring to the fact that the People's Temple bequeathed all its foreign bank accounts not to the PNC or Guyana, but to the Communist Party of the USSR.
When Jimmy Carter was campaigning for president, his wife Rosalind obligingly charmed the liberals of San Francisco with the help of the People's Temple. Grateful to People's Temple, she dined with Jim Jones and kept a limited correspondence. When Jimmy Carter became president, Jim Jones delighted in bragging about his connection to the First Lady. He showed everyone a snapshot of the two of them together and played the audio he had recorded of a phone call between himself and Rosalind Carter.
He's Assistant District Attorney here. He was highly impressed with your husband and your commitment in more ways than one. We appreciate your Christian ethical background, also the broad liberality in which you respect other people's religious perspective. I can't say how moved I am. I usually don't lack, being a preacher, I don't lack for words, but I'm deeply touched. Is there anything particular that we could do for you?
I didn't have anything in mind. I just wanted to call because Timmy had gotten his letter from Tennessee and said that you had been saying some nice things about it, so he told me to call you and thank you. So,
I'd also sent a letter. There had been some negative press about your son participating in raising funds for a gay bar, and I wanted you to know that we were 100% behind you in that. I don't know how far it has gone. There's no end to the degree that some people will attempt to malign good people. But I don't know whether you received my letter, but I sent a letter of encouragement, not that you need it. We're going to win. We're going to win.
We get the mail eventually, but it's stacked up so much. The last primary and the convention time, it just came in so much that it's taken us a while to get it organized and get it open. We're just about to do that.
Well, you call us. We have many, many thousands of members, and I have considerable influence in the Disciples of Christ denomination, which I'm an official. Anything we can do, you call. We're 100% behind you.
Of all the government entities and mental health professionals intimately involved with Jim Jones and the People's Temple, only one tried to find out what was really happening in Jonestown, and they killed him for it. On the next episode of Transmissions from Jonestown.
Greetings to the people and fellow comrade brothers and sisters.
And they said they didn't care with our licensed weapons if we shot you in the legs and laid you down. So that's what we're going to do.
Mom, Dad, I'm okay. My hands are often tied, but they're not. And I would appreciate it if everyone would just calm down and not try to find me.
A lot of documentation which I will provide you here today, it indicates the strong possibility that Jonestown and the People's Temple was in reality a mass mind control experiment conducted by the CIA as a follow-up to something called MKUltra.
Yes, the files, the myriad numbers of files, COINTELPRO, system files now that push a button, a policeman can push a button out on the beat, and in a matter of minutes he's got your full report.
The Attention Span Recovery Project would like to thank the Jonestown Institute and the anonymous contributors. If you have any questions or comments about this program, you can contact us at radiojonestown@gmail.com or follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Radio Jonestown.
End transmission.
You've never laughed so much until you hear Patty talk about the radio on the night we were going to die.
First of all, you got to understand the radio. Okay, first of all, you should understand that I was afraid to die. That would be the first thing to understand. Fuck you too, nonchalant. So I come in working hard, and everyone but me decides we're going to die. I don't want to die. I was happy. So everybody, their bravo, is going to die, and they asked my opinion, which I thought I should answer. And I said, no, I don't think I'll live. That was the first mistake. They go around the room and ask, what's your opinion? I said, well, I don't know, man, there must be some other way. Go on the boat, ship, out to high seas, swim, drop from the boat. I didn't particularly want to do that. Fat bitch, you don't have an opinion. Cow, what? Can I have an opinion why I want to die? No, you're going to die, you son of a bitch. Fuck out. I don't want to die. Fuck out. So everybody's sitting around this room deciding, will they jump first? Maybe they'll push me. I'm sure by then they're going to push me. And this little fucking radio in the background talking, blah, 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 blah. And the radio is going all the time, they're all going to die. I still didn't want to die. So I said, I thought maybe we could talk to somebody. We called Dr. Reed. You should die, you son of a fat bitch. Why don't you want to die, you cunt lapper? 89 hours later, we're still talking about whether we're going to die. By then, I thought maybe we should. I told one person, I said, if we don't, I'm going to kill you, then I'm going to kill myself. I hate you. I hate your fucking guts. So then, this little fucking radio. We're in Georgetown. You folks are here, and I'm sure that they'll all have to be dead before I can get here. And so we're getting these news to get over here, and they got the radio on. Now this goddamn radio is talking to me. And all I can hear, I know what, we got all these code signals, Johnny's place, that means something to somebody. I know what the fuck.
Cuba.
I just got there. Henry, Morgan, Thomas, don't lift your foot. If you go to the picture, get your show. I know what the fuck. I'm sitting there trying to talk to these defos that I'm sitting in the room with, and I hear WB6, go to Roger, go to Johnny, blah, blah, blah.
That's the way that radio sounds you heard.
And I can hear him banging in the background. Need a Johnny, need a John. Don't cry, Martha, but she cries this time. But she shouldn't be crying. Face to death. What is she doing? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then we got hours and hours and hours and hours and hours.
She heard Mother and Stephen, but it's good to laugh about everything. She heard Mother talking to Stephen, and Stephen was telling Mother we have to die, and so forth, but she didn't know what the hell was going on.
And finally, I decided, fine, die, you son of a bitch. By then I wanted to die. It was a joy. I said, that's fine, but with just one request, I want to take that goddamn fucking radio. It's been talking to me for 5 days. And I've agreed to go on the boat. I've agreed to die, but I take the radio, and it goes first.